the place where I think we really started to diverge from the old internet was right around 2006 to 2010. And that's 2006 is when the iPhone came out, and 2010 is when the iPhone plus social media exploded. And so in that period, Facebook was founded in 2004, I think, and Google went public in 2004. You had a whole bunch of different social media sites vying to be what Facebook became, and Facebook was the winner. And that whole sort of push towards centralization where, you want to be where your friends are. And if your friends are on Facebook, then you're on Facebook. That all sort of happened in that 2006 to 2010 kind of period.
Writer, blogger, and author Wendy Grossman joins John and Scoop this time on the Plutopia podcast. We discuss the differences between early internet culture and the current state of the internet and social media.
Hey, welcome everybody to another session of the Plutopia News Network podcast. Today our guest is Wendy Grossman. Wendy's a freelance writer and blogger focusing on computers, freedom, and privacy. Lately, you've been writing a bit about AI. She's been writing since the early 1990s, really, about net.wars, as in net.wars, which was the name of her book by that name, which was published in 1997. Wendy, we're so glad you're here.
Well, it's nice to be here. Originally, I've always said Net Wars was about the border wars between cyberspace and real life. And since we stopped doing computers, freedom, and privacy conferences, and since cyberspace has become a word that people reject, I've sort of shifted to saying I write about computers, freedom, and privacy. And the reality is that, when I started doing it, the reason there was a dot in Net Wars was it was meant to look a little like a Usenet news group. And of course, no one uses Usenet anymore. And no one uses cyberspace anymore because everybody is online all the time. I mean, it's not, when you and I first got online, we had to use a modem and dial up, and it really did feel like you were going somewhere else. But I mean, now it's just on everybody's phone, so it's not really doesn't feel so separate.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. My wife used to glare at me sometimes. She'd say, "Why do you just keep staring at that thing?" As in a computer monitor. And now I see her staring for hours at a time at her phone. It's pretty much the same thing. I mean, it's a window, really, I think.
Yeah.
But it's also an obsession, I think, to some extent for most people. But you and I go back to a time when very few people had computers and very few people were aware that there was an internet.
I first discovered there was an internet in 1988 when the Internet Worm made the front page. That was when I read about this network that connected all these university and corporate research institutions. And the next thing I read about the internet was a book on cybercrime. Well, it was bulletin board systems mostly, but it was a book about early computer crime.
I'm realizing that the second time I heard about the internet, or when it really kind of sunk in with me that it was a thing that I might be interested in, was when I had recently joined the Well and they said, "Hey, we're connecting to the internet." And I kind of didn't pick up on what that was going to mean, but it was clearly a significant thing. Everybody was excited about it.
Was that about like 94 or something? Because that's when everybody connected to the internet.
I think the Well actually connected to the internet in 90 or 91, that they actually were reachable by Telnet at that point, but I'm not 100% sure of the date.
I didn't join the Well till 95. But when I did, that was how I accessed it, was via Telnet.
And I guess we should say the Well that we're talking about is a seminal online community, Whole Earth Electronic Link, which still exists. And in fact, the reason that we're having this discussion is because Wendy saw me post about my podcast and said, "Hey, let's do one," And we've known each other for a long time, but we've been out of touch for a long time. And when I first met you, Net Wars had just come out, and I think it would be interesting to tell people today how you at the time were defining the whole concept of net wars. Kind of what were you talking about?
Well, by the time I did that book, um, we'd already had the Church of Scientology had been pursuing people for posting its secrets on Usenet. We had the British police wanting to censor whole swaths of Usenet because they said it was full of porn and bad things, and particularly child abuse images. And so there was that was actually mid 90s was the founding of the Internet Watch Foundation, which still exists in Britain. It's a hotline people can call and report illegal material, and if it and it reviews the material and recommends that it be blocked. So we were already having battles over copyright. I mean, there were just a lot of places where what the internet was bringing was butting up against the laws we had, and particularly at the beginning, computer hackers who were kids wandering around. At that time it wasn't so much criminals, it was kids wandering around the internet trying to log into computers that they shouldn't. um, we were seeing some very unreasonable prosecutions too. And so all of those things kind of wrapped up together. Now, the first Computers, Freedom, and Privacy conference, the person who told me about it was Mark Rotenberg, who went on to found and run the Electronic Privacy Information Center and is now doing something in AI. And Mark said for the first time they were going to get hackers and police to talk to each other. And so that was kind of the model for CFP, but it was also kind of the mental model for loosely net wars, was the idea of the ways that the internet was going to force us to rethink laws, or was going to pose a challenge to the systems in existence. And of course, what's happened in the last 10 years has been much more centralization, and we have these new very powerful companies that Facebook, something like Facebook or Google, or with the power of Amazon, was not really imagined when I started writing about the internet.
In the United States, we have some people that are, fighting their own net wars. The Christian conservatives have become really a pain to deal with online. Is there a similar kind of thing going on in the UK?
Well, how are they a pain to deal with online? Because I mean, I'm on things like Twitter and things where I see a lot of Americans, and I'm not really sure what you are. I mean, I don't see them myself.
Mostly in social media, if you post something that is critical of any of their heroes or their favorite subjects, then you'll get just trolled like crazy from some of these people. It's happened to me many times.
I have been very fortunate through most. I mean, I've been in, people have said mean things a few times, but I mean, I've been really lucky about not attracting large amounts of abuse. But I know that any really outspoken woman on certain kinds of topics definitely, and I think they get it in every culture. I don't think the US is an exception. It might be a different group that's doing it, but British female MPs say that they just get horrible stuff. And people like the Canadian tennis player Rebecca Marino, she had depression and she was kind of forced off the tennis tour for a while, partly because of people just being absolutely horrible to her on social media.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the effects of the mainstreaming of the internet, is that you get pretty much everybody online, and some people are not that nice. And some people are, I mean, through their anonymity, are feeling somewhat protected and acting much worse than they ever would in face to
Well, there's
face.
three things there. First of all, I don't believe that anonymity is the problem. Second of all, we had flame wars on the well where everybody was
It's
identified.
true.
And the third thing is that the way you don't have that is you have human moderators, which is what the well had and what Kix had and what CompuServe and AOL had. And even now, if you go around the web and you go to a web board that's well managed, where the comments are curated, their abuse may get posted, but it doesn't turn into a problem because it's squelched.
Yeah,
But
and it's hard to scale that to social
it's
media
very hard. You
without
can't. It doesn't scale.
algorithms. Yeah.
Right. It's labor intensive. It doesn't scale. But that it has been in the history of the net. That has always been the answer. Has been human moderators.
And I should clarify that when I say anonymous, I don't mean that you can't see what their name is or that you don't know what their identity is, but just that there's so many of them, and you know, there's just so much foo out there that people don't really know who the other people are. You know, there's a level of abstraction that kind of removes you from the person that you're attacking, you know,
Right.
if you're a troll. And trolls have always sort of leveraged that and depended on that. I think that they really don't believe somebody's going to come after them. And in a way, it's like you've gone into a game or something, a sort of fantasy land where you can become this other person who is crass and terrible and post things that you would never consider saying aloud in mixed company. I mean, I believe that is an aspect of what's going on. I don't think.
I think there's general agreement that there's a kind of the screen has a distancing effect, and you don't see particularly when it's just text. You don't really see the human, and you don't. I remember when when net wars for a while used to get published on a site called the Inquirer, and I used to get a lot more email in those days. It was a more visible site. And, I would get the occasional abusive email, and I had a policy, which is that I always wrote back. But if it was really abusive, I would just say something like, thanks for writing. But several times I would then get a follow up from the guy saying, oh my God, I had no idea a real person would answer this. I'm so sorry. It was really interesting,
You've kind of got me thinking about mentioning the flame wars on the well. I'm thinking about the distinction between having wars with people that you actually spend time with and have history with. That's a different kind of fight than a sort of conflicting interaction you may have with somebody who you don't really know, who is, as you say, you have distance from them. And those tend to be more transient too, whereas the flame wars on the well would just kind of go on and on. I mean, we still do that. We still have thrashes on the well that just kind of continue and continue. And in some cases, they become very circular because nobody wants the other guy to have the last word. And I think, it's human nature within communities and within families to have that kind of conflict. The other kind of more impersonal conflict, it seems to me, is kind of something newer and weirder than what we had before.
Well, Gail Williams, when she was the community manager on the well, said to me that one thing the well had that something like Twitter doesn't is you have all these different conferences on different topics, and you would see somebody being an absolute jackass in media or someplace, and you would really hate them. Except that you were also in the parenting conference where you saw that they were staying up all night fretting because their kid was sick. And that gave you a context for their behavior in a way, and it gave you more sides of the person. But one of the things about today's social media sites is they collapse everything into just this one stream. So you don't really see the different aspects of their life.
In recent years, we've had things like Gamergate that cropped up, and it was basically a right-wing backlash against feminism, especially in the gaming space. And that has quieted down a little bit, but there's similar things happening in politics. We have all the people that are, part of the Trump clan, and they're constantly on social media and will attack anyone and everyone that differs.
The interesting thing in Gamergate is the woman at the heart of it, whose name I have forgotten.
Zoe Quinn, yes.
Yeah, she wrote a book about it. And her contention is that at the heart of the beginning of Gamergate was a story of domestic violence or domestic abuse. And and so what happened afterwards was that being sort of escalated. And I think that's interesting because I don't think that ever came out in any of the press reporting of the time. I reviewed for more than 20 or 25 years. I reviewed all sorts of books about internet policy, tech, the sort of nexus of computers, freedom, and privacy for ZDNet UK. And that was one of the books I reviewed at some point. I've got a page of links to it if you ever want to see it.
Yeah, in the state of Texas, we have a new push that's pretty much aimed at females and of people that are transgender. The governor has pushed out against any educational institution that promotes diversity and equality and similar things, and they want to actually stop providing any funding to any university that transgresses his beliefs against diversity. Do you see that kind of thing happening outside the U.S.?
Well, there's been a lot of division, some of it deliberately fomented, about trans rights here too. But it's really different in that, for one thing, you don't really have the same sense of white Christian grievance because, for one thing, the Church of England is an established church. And it's kind of, as a guy at there's a think tank that studies religion and politics here. And the guy there said to me, it's kind of hard to get to present yourself as a victim when all these bishops sit in the House of Lords and the king of the head of state is also the head of the Christian church. And I never thought there would be anything good about having an established church, but I guess that's it. Is you can't claim that there is this war on Christianity in the same way. I mean, King Charles, when he's crowned next month, is going to be crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury.
We've talked a little bit about how the internet was and how it is. Kind of as a kind of overview question, kind of how do you see the evolution from the internet as it was in, say, 1993 and the internet as it is in 2023, and what's happened over time? Like, what is it that we have?
Well, the internet, I think we should say 95, because in 1993, commercial traffic was still not allowed on the internet. But the internet at that time was actually pretty hard to use. A lot of it didn't have graphical interfaces, and the web was very slow, and you would follow painfully one link to the next and not really be sure you had found the information you were looking for. I remember a friend of mine suddenly saying one day that he was shocked to realize that all the information he'd looked up on the web that day was reliable. Like, that was a really big watershed. But the place where I think, we really started to diverge from the old internet was right around 2006 to 2010. And that's 2006 is when the iPhone came out, and 2010 is when the iPhone plus social media exploded. And so in that period, Facebook was founded in 2004, I think, and Google went public in 2004. You had a whole bunch of different social media sites vying to be what Facebook became, and Facebook was the winner. And that whole sort of push towards centralization, where you want to be where your friends are, and if your friends are on Facebook, then you're on Facebook. That all sort of happened in that 2006 to 2010 kind of period.
Well, as somebody who's written about conflict online, what are some of the key conflicts you see currently and maybe over the years too?
Well, I used to worry a lot about the influence of the mobile phone world because the whole thing about the internet that we talked about was that it was open and anybody could write something to run on it. And I mean, Tim Berners-Lee didn't have to get a license to invent the web. He just invented the web and stuck it out there, and people said, "Oh, this is cool." And same with Skype, and the same with I don't know, email and all sorts of things. But that is the opposite of the ethos of the mobile phone world, where they want everything to be controlled, everything to be curated, only the things that they want running on their network run on their network. And that's the same ethos as things like Facebook and Twitter. You can't sit, especially now, you can't sit down and write a little app for Twitter and have it do anything. And so I always thought that was actually a really important conflict that kind of got overlooked in the repeated copyright battles, the copyright, censorship, surveillance, all the things that we fight about sort of every day, privacy, and so on. And the other thing is, going all the way back to 2001. I think that was when was it Google that bought DoubleClick? And
I think so, yeah.
When you could see that the direction of travel was these large companies buying these other companies that would make them more powerful, and some of them might have been competitors. I mean, the fact that Facebook was allowed to acquire WhatsApp and Instagram, which could have gone on to be competitors. So the things that we overlooked a lot were things like antitrust and the influence of the mobile world, and the things that in the meantime there have been these things that we fight over and over again: encryption, encryption, censorship, surveillance, privacy, all of those things. And we're about to go through another cycle of it with AI. I mean, it's already starting. You've got artists suing Stable Diffusion because their work has been used in its training data, and you've got the Italian Data Protection Authority has blocked ChatGPT in Italy to stop it from processing Italian users' personal data because it doesn't have a legal basis to do it. So there's a whole new round coming.
Do you still think of these as boundary disputes? These kinds of issues?
Less so because, particularly with personal data, all these companies like Amazon and all these huge data brokers are all trying to link our offline person identity to our online identity. And so, if they can link your mobile phone to your web browser on your desk, then they can follow you in the real world as well as in the online world. So, those barriers, like I said before, they're really kind of dropping away.
Back when I got onto the internet in the mid 80s, we almost idolized some of the big companies like Apple and Microsoft, maybe. And when Google came along, it was supposed to be a new savior because you could really go out and do a great search. And as time has gone along, those heroes become less heroic and more threatening in the fact that they had gained so much power. The European Union seems to be really taking that, taking a hand in trying to control that. Do you see that as a continuing battle, or is there any hope that these big companies will actually begin to behave?
Well, it depends what company you're talking about. I mean, because a company like Facebook gets lots and lots of attention. Some of these data brokers, people seem to barely notice they're there, and of course they're doing the same things. But I think Facebook is in trouble. It keeps getting fined. Apple's thing of blocking, of insisting that users have to opt into tracking is going to cost. Facebook estimates it's going to cost it $10 billion in revenue this year. And nobody seems to care about the metaverse very much. And, but something like Facebook can take a really long time to die. So.
I do have a thought about that, though. And this is something that I saw recently, and it made absolute sense to me that, there has been much made of the ability to track people on the internet so that you can decide what they're likely to buy and sell it to them.
Mm-hmm.
And recently they found that ads that are served based on the contextual subject matter of the page that people are looking at are just as effective. So the thinking now is that they don't really have to do all of this tracking, that they can just serve ads based on context, and that will be sufficient. And that would undo the problem of whether you can track people or not. That would make the surveillance more irrelevant if that's really the case.
Well, that's what DuckDuckGo has contended for a long time.
Yeah.
The problem is there's two problems with ads. I mean, one is the tracking and monitoring and so forth, but the other is that a lot of ads are really, really annoying. If somebody puts a video ad on a page where I'm actually trying to read an article, it's very distracting. And that's when you reach for the ad blocker.
But yeah, that's where you, in other words, vote with your feet. And I was going to say, many people use ad blockers and don't even realize that the ads are there. And I don't know what the impact of that is. I'm sure there's some sense of a war between the people who depend on advertising and the ad blockers who depend on their ability to block ads. But so far, it seems to me that the ad blockers are pretty successful in suppressing ads.
Well, they're pretty successful, but there are definitely sites that say, excuse me, you're running an ad blocker, go away.
It's true. It's true.
And,
turn off your ad blocker. In fact, that's an important part of the technology of the ad blocker is the ability to switch it off for a specific site.
Yeah, I mean, the problem underlying this, though, that we really have never solved in all this time is how do you want to pay for content on the internet? If you aren't going to accept advertising, what are you going to do? Are you going to pay subscriptions to 100 different things? I don't think so.
Well, maybe we do have a potential solution there in that people really are starting not to subscribe, not to 100 different things, but to some number of things. And it decreases the breadth of your commitment of mind share online to fewer sites, but you can still pretty much fill your online time just looking at those sites. So maybe that is where we're going. Maybe it is going to be a question of either you're served ads or you're served the content without ads, but you pay for it.
I mean, that's the future that I thought we would have by now. I thought, I don't know, 20 years ago, I certainly thought that we would have a lot of two-track things where either you consumed ads or you paid, or there'd be some kind of tiers, but it's very limiting, if you're people like us who want to read as widely as possible, and and one of the things that social media does for you is send you to sites that you wouldn't have known about necessarily. That sacrificing that because everything is paywall, that would be a really big loss.
Well, there would be an option to forego the paywall, at least in many cases, and accept the advertising. But there you have the problem of the ad blockers, which sort of disrupts the ability of the site to serve enough ads to actually replace the cost of the subscription.
But there again, in the 90s, everybody thought that we would have micropayments and you'd be able to pay like a nickel or a dime or something to read, to read one article, and that's not what happens. You go to the site, and the site says, sorry, you got to subscribe, $20, $20 a month, or $50 a year, and you want to read one article. You don't know anything about the publication yet.
Yeah, that is interesting. We actually could have micropayments now. I mean, it's feasible with the payment infrastructures that we have now. So I'm a little surprised that it hasn't become more common.
Actually, I'm not sure we really can have. Well, I don't think we really do have an infrastructure that's cheap enough to pay like a nickel or a dime for something. Now there's a Dutch company called Blendel that set out to do sort of the equivalent of a subscription to print generally, and you would have a certain amount of money in your account, and you would pay a very small amount to The Economist or something to read an article, and it would just be deducted from your account, and then you'd stick in another £10 or something. And I don't know how they're doing. I know they still exist, but I don't know. And I know that in Germany, at least, they were successful enough to pay publishers some money, some money. I don't know how it's going elsewhere.
Well, Apple seems to be trying to be that kind of a service with all their, the App Store things that they do, and they're also collecting subscription fees for other companies because, just over the years had added stuff on, and it was all being billed out of Apple iTunes. And
they're taking 30% though, right?
It depends on who they're dealing with. Some of them, I've seen the percentages were even higher, but basically, it took me a while to realize what was going on because all of a sudden, I would go on to the Apple TV app, and they had links to all these other streaming services that I was paying for, and it's like, well, they are trying to become like the network operator for all of these people. Mm. And I just, I don't know how great that is because Apple has a sketchy history for things like, security and privacy and greed.
Well, also, anytime you're dependent on another company for the goodwill to continue offering your service, it's really a risky position to be in. I mean, think of Farmville on Facebook, which, just got disrupted one day because Facebook decided it didn't care anymore, or anybody on Twitter at the moment, or any number of dozens, if not hundreds, of Google products that have been canceled after 2 years or 4 years or 5 years because the company did, it's not we're not really making enough money from it, and or acres and acres of internet communities that have been bought up by companies that then decided they weren't profitable enough to bother with. I mean, Television Without Pity being a great example. Very vibrant site bought up by, I think maybe TV Digest or something. And one day they just decided, we're not making enough money from this. We can get rid of this, and then it was gone. And there was a great line about this on Twitter that came up even before Elon Musk started talking about buying it, which is, on the internet, your home will always leave you.
That reminds me of I used to work for Consumer Reports, and at one point they owned a site called The Consumerist, and I think The Consumerist is no longer part of Consumer Reports. I think they still exist, but there was this whole thing about how you have an independent site, and then somebody acquires them, and then after they work with them for a while, for whatever reason or maybe stack of reasons, they start to think about letting go of them. And then when they let go of them, there's a question about what happens to all the people who spent some time every day reading that site or interacting with that site. And you've mentioned Twitter and Facebook, which are like huge examples of companies that have a substantial user base that has depended on them for a long time to work a certain way. So when Facebook tries to do something different or shift things around, they usually get a lot of flack. And Twitter is actually changing substantially because it's been acquired by an Austinite, a fairly prominent Austinite who seems to be a bit of a loon. And Twitter looks like it's Twitter sort of looks like the Hindenburg of social media right now.
I know. It's very sad to me because for the 5 years up until November 2022, Twitter was just such a daily delight for me. I mean, there was so much interesting stuff and there were great jokes. And during the pandemic, being able to follow some of the best medical experts in the world was just, it just felt such an important thing. And you watch it thin out every day.
Yeah, over the years, I've purchased a lot of applications that I use in my studio here and use online. And all of a sudden, I guess a few years ago, things that I thought I owned suddenly became a subscription. You can't buy the application, the program. You have to subscribe, and it's a yearly subscription, and a lot of them are not cheap.
Well, this is why I used Word 2007 all the way up until about 2013 when I switched to LibreOffice.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I use a lot of the open source stuff, but when they get really successful, suddenly they're not so open anymore.
Yeah, I just subscribe to everything. Actually, I don't. I mean, I've tried those subscription models, and in a way, I would rather have a subscription to some software package and get all the updates than worry about updating periodically. So I don't think
with a word processor, what updating do you really need? I mean, Bruce Sterling, who's another Austinite, I remember seeing him being asked at a conference in London one time, so are you excited about virtual reality? And he looked at them and he said, I put words in a row.
Yep, that sounds like Bruce. Well, and it's hard to be excited about virtual reality unless you're one of the committed, I guess. And that's actually another question. We have this virtual reality thing that Facebook says it wants to do. They say they want to build a metaverse, and they changed their name to Meta. But I don't see a Facebook VR environment yet. And I can't imagine, to me, it seems like broad VR would be sort of like broad 3D movies. Eventually, they go away because people get headaches.
And people don't really care, people don't really care about 3D movies. But my question is, did you see the Icelandic tourist board's response to the metaverse announcement?
Missed it. What'd they say?
Oh, go on YouTube and you have to watch it. It is hilariously funny.
I sense that they must have been skeptical.
Just look up Icelandverse.
Kind of just after this metaverse thing was announced, probably last year's South by Southwest 2022, I recall seeing a metaverse session where they were showing you the metaverse, and it was essentially a catalog where you had poor three-dimensional displays of merchandise that you could click on to buy. And I thought, well, maybe that's kind of what they're thinking the metaverse should be.
Well, I mean, they're a commercial company. They're obviously going to try to find some way to monetize this thing. But I mean, do we really need that for shopping?
I don't think we need it, period. And, it always impressed me that while people were having sort of lavish concepts for the internet and for online networks, including VR. I mean, VR was, it's a pretty high bandwidth proposition, and it's Yeah, a lot of effort goes into doing relatively simple things in VR. But with all of that thinking going on, meanwhile, what really takes off and becomes the most popular thing on the planet is texting. People just want to send text to each other and maybe sharing photos, you know.
Well, also Richard Bartle, who created the first multi-user dungeon, the original MUD at the University of Essex.
Yeah.
He says that in the text-based games, the physics is better because when you fall in the water, you actually get wet.
It's true. It's true. MUDs and Moos and Muses are all fairly compelling, and they're totally text-based.
Yeah, my first game was the adventure game, which was all text. Go north, go south, pick up whatever, and it was addicting because I never encountered something like that.
I believe in this country, the killer one of those games was the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy game.
Oh yes, that was wonderful. We got it over here too.
Yeah.
So I wonder what happens now. Let's focus on Twitter for a minute. So Twitter is obviously at least fragmenting, and some people are leaving for Mastodon. In fact, a huge number of people have moved to Mastodon, and a lot of the people I know are on Mastodon now and spending most of their time there and not on Twitter. On the other hand,
the fact that I've had a Mastodon account for 4 years.
Yeah, me too. I got mine in 2017, I think. Yeah. But I didn't really start using it until this Twitter thing happened. Mm. And, so now I've got a Mastodon account and a Twitter account, and I'm still paying attention to both of them. And the big difference I see on Twitter is that the trending stuff that they like to show you is almost all, it's dominated by, I think, the right-wing preferences of Elon Musk as he's flirting with becoming a fascist. And
unfortunately, I never pay attention to that.
Yeah.
So, I try to read Mastodon first, and then so that I'll ignore where there's duplication on Twitter, so I'll ignore it. But
Well, moving to Mastodon for me was a lot like going back to CFP. I mean, it was like the kinds of people that I hung out with at the CFP conference and right. Other parts of the internet early on, including people I hadn't really talked much to or thought of in years, but were friends of mine. They're all showing up on Mastodon, and that's who's there. And you don't have all this you don't have the celebrity stuff going on, and you don't have as
ads.
Many trolls. I mean, trolls get shut down on Mastodon unless they happen to be on a server that likes trolls. I don't think there's many of those.
Often the server gets blocked.
Yeah, exactly.
And there are no ads. And so the question is really going to be, as you keep having these sort of influx of users and servers that were very small 8 months ago and are now not very small, how they're going to afford their energy bills and how they're going to be able to scale up. And this is the open question about this Fediverse. But there are some very interesting possibilities. For example, I think the German government has set it up so German government agencies have their own Mastodon servers. Well, all of a sudden it becomes really easy to tell whether they're authentic or not, because they're coming from the right server or they're not.
When I joined Mastodon, I fairly quickly, well, not when I joined it, more recently, actually, when I started paying more attention to it, I discovered a Patreon for mastodon.social and for the main Mastodon project. And I signed up to give them money. And then I started hearing that there were other people who were operating servers who were also setting up Patreon or similar things in order to just take donations from people. And, I think that theoretically it's possible that if people felt strongly enough about the system, they would just voluntarily give money and you'd be able to make enough.
Doesn't the Well have a Mastodon server?
The Well has a Mastodon server. It's not a formal Well server, but it was set up by a member of the Well who's technically super proficient, and she just wanted to experiment with it. So she she set up a Mastodon server, and a bunch of people joined it, and she learned how to manage it, and shared a lot of what she was learning as she went. And now we have a pretty good Mastodon server there. I moved to that server at the time. I had been on Mastodon.social, and the move was not difficult, and I was able to move all of I think you can move your followers, but not your follows. You have to refollow people after you do a migration like that.
Well, you can. One of the interesting things you can do on Mastodon, I think you can export your list of follows, and then you can import it as a spreadsheet, and you can import it again. But I think what you don't get to take with you is your messages.
Right. Which was okay.
Which is a deterrent for me because, I'm on a server I picked at random 4 years ago, and if I had been joining now, I probably would have joined the well Mastodon server, or one that belonged to a friend or something. But there's not really a lot of reason to move.
Well, there's another thing about Mastodon that I think is pretty interesting, which is that you could set up accounts on multiple servers, and one would probably be your main server, but you could also set up accounts on other servers if you had an interest there, because you can see strictly the local traffic. And in fact, there's a fork of Mastodon called Hometown that was set up specifically for creating a local instance. So you might join a Hometown, an instance that is built on Hometown just to hang out with that set of people. It becomes kind of like a Discord,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've never really come to grips with Discord.
Well, Discord is another thing that's picking up a lot of mind share, similar to Mastodon. Of course, it's not a federated network or anything like that, but a lot of people are spending more and more time on Discord servers, which are like, you can build a little community on one of those.
Yeah, I did know that. I just don't really. I haven't taken to it the same way, because I think what I like about Mastodon is it's text dense, whereas Discord seems to have an awful lot of graphics lying around.
Yeah, exactly. And it has audio. But the thing I was wondering about, and kind of what I wanted to get to, is what happens if we really do become more decentralized? I mean, there were some advantages in having a centralized system like Twitter had been. And you mentioned one of those, that, you could see all those medical experts in one place, and have a pretty good idea what was going on during the pandemic. And emergency services, that's another thing.
Yeah.
So decentralization could be more effective, maybe depending on how it's federated, if it is federated. But we could also just have a balkanization of online media, or social media, so that people are just kind of all over the place, and there's fewer ways for people to interact sort of in a more global way with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly read that Twitter's gradual demise is a disaster for disaster relief. That people had gotten very used to using it to coordinate things. But you see, there again, this is the problem. We had public authorities and governments and state agencies and NGOs and everybody depending on the very weak reed of a commercial company that, even before Musk bought it, was not in financial trouble exactly, but it wasn't as well funded as some of the others. And so the point is that everybody was lazy for 10 years. Instead of building something that they owned and that would be reliable in an emergency, they sort of just grabbed onto the nearest thing. And you see it now. I mean, I had this argument with a friend of mine who says, "Oh, everybody's gone back to Twitter. It's going to be fine." And I'm saying, no, you cannot rely on Twitter to be there. You must build something that will be a plan B, because you cannot depend on Twitter continuing to support what you want to do. And I think this is the problem: is it's very tempting to say, "Oh, this site is there and everybody's there, so it's easy to set it up, and we'll just take advantage." But in the long run, I think you always have to own your own community.
Well, John talked about balkanization, which is a term that has described, the breakup of big things into smaller parts. Europe was
Mhm.
that, Eastern Europe was that way. That's where that came from. But in social media, I've noticed that the successful Twitter people are generally well-known people, but the average person really isn't a Twitter influencer, a Twitter contributor. And I communicate with a lot of these people. From even on Facebook, that they're not famous folks, but they want a place to where they can gather and stay in touch with their circle of friends. And a
Mhm.
lot of these things that people have tried to move to, remember Google Plus, that was going to be the next big thing,
Oh yeah,
and it's gone. It
yeah.
and it's tough to do that. These things generally don't prove to be scalable, and I still, I have Mastodon set up, but the people I deal with are a lot of techie folks, and they're really not famous, and they're not on Mastodon. So I don't go there as often as say John would. John is a well-known person. I'm sort of a guy in the periphery, and that's where people are going back to Facebook who said, "Oh, I'm going to go try Mastodon," and my friends come back and say, "Well, no, it didn't work out for me, so I'm back here."
Yeah. Well, I've always said that community doesn't scale. I think that's actually one of the things that we have learned from the internet. um,
Yeah, I think it's totally clear. Uh, even, I mean, well, the well, you see that the well has probably a few hundred active users, but it's really a bunch of sub communities.
mhm.
There's a bunch of we call it a conferencing system, and everything's set up in conferences, which are main subject areas. And people have some smaller set of conferences they hang out in, but nobody could possibly read everything that gets posted on the well every day. Uh,
You know,
you can't scale conversations and you can't scale communities.
Fortunately, the well has a command that allows you to forget the topics you don't want to read.
I rarely do that.
I rarely do it too, but on the other hand, I have never ever read anything in the cool and stupid ads topic in the television conference because I know I'm never going to see the same ads. You know,
Yeah, I kind of
um,
skip that one. I read it fast. I have to read everything in media because I'm a host of the media conference.
oh God, that used to be impossible.
It's still pretty hard. The media conference on the well has changed a lot, though. It's not quite as crazy as it was. We had a member of that conference who posted whole long articles, and we asked him not to do that anymore. So we don't have those as much.
Mm.
But on the well really teaches you a lot. I've learned a lot more about community from being a member of the well than anything else I've done, really.
I read Howard Rheingold's The Virtual Community before I joined the well, and I reviewed it for somebody. I forget, probably New Scientist or somebody.
Yeah.
And the thing I didn't believe in the book, when I read the book and I read all about the parenting conference and the guy whose kid died of leukemia, and and everybody helping
Yeah.
and
Phil Catalfo. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and trying to bring him casseroles and decode the medical results and all this kind of thing. And I sat there going, he has to have edited these postings. They can't all be spelled perfectly like this. And so the first thing I did when I went on the well was go in the parenting conference and look up some of the postings to see, and damn it, they were spelled correctly. He didn't edit them at all. And I couldn't believe it because like on everything else I'd ever been on, typos and misspellings were the order of the day.
The members of the well tend to be pretty literate. That's for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, and also
And
the
well
well
spoken.
also makes it easy for you to correct your posting.
When the well began, one of the first things they did was invite people who were writers and journalists to become members, and I think they comped them accounts, in fact, to get that like good content through participation.
Well, also again they comped hosts if you hosted a conference. So there was motivation for people to become moderators and do a good job.
Yeah, and there are some really excellent moderators on the well. And I have to say that when I first started as a host, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. It took years to kind of really figure it out. I want to change the subject a little bit here because we just have a few minutes left. And I really wanted to ask you about the Skeptic.
Okay.
So you started the Skeptic, you founded it years ago, and you were what, the editor for 2 or 3 years?
Well, let's be clear that the magazine we're talking about is the one at skeptic.org.uk.
Yeah.
And the Skeptic, it started out as the British and Irish Skeptic, and then we just made it the Skeptic. And then several years later, a guy named Michael Shermer started a magazine in Los Angeles called The Skeptic. And it's not that Skeptic. I started it in 1987, and I edited it for, I think, 2 or 2.5 years or something, and the whole time looking for the next person. And I passed it on to the next people, and they did it for 8 years. And then they came back to me and said, "We're going to close it." And I said, "No, you can't do that. We have stakeholders now. We have a guy who's been drawing a cartoon for us for 8 years. You can't, 10 years. You can't just say to them, 'Sorry, we don't want you anymore.'" So they said, "Well, the only other alternative we'll consider is that you take it back." So then I edited it for another 2 years, and I gave it to somebody who then found the next editor. And so we are now on the third editor in succession that I did not have anything to do with finding. And so I'm very happy that the Skeptic might actually have its own future without me. And I want that because I wanted it to survive me. I did not want it to be dependent on me. I wanted it to be something that continued, and whatever good it was going to do in the world went on doing it.
What made you decide that you wanted to start the Skeptic in the first place?
Oh, well, I was living in Ireland, and I didn't know anybody. And I was very interested in the work of the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, which is now just called the Center for Inquiry. And, I went to visit them in Buffalo, and I said, "Is there anything I could do?" And they said, "Well, could you start a newsletter?" And I said, "Yeah, I don't see why not." I mean, I had edited the Cornell Folk Song Club newsletter. Why couldn't I do a Skeptic newsletter? And I got it started, and I got it some subscribers, and they helped, and some other people who were here helped. And I think it did what we hoped it would do, which is that it helped people meet other skeptics. I mean, one of the problems you had is I would get all these letters from people who are, "There's nobody in my area who thinks the way I do. It is so wonderful to have this magazine," And I feel like it's done some good things, that it has helped. When Simon Singh was sued for libel by the British Chiropractic Association, one of the things that helped him, I think, in his case, was all the skeptics in the pub meets that were going on around the country. And I don't think those wouldn't exist without the Skeptic. And I can say that because the guy who founded it was in my living room when he said that he had this idea. I said, "Well, go for it." So, it really came down to, in 1986 or thereabouts, if you looked at British television, whenever there was a TV show where they discussed mediums or ghosts or anything, the only opposition to the claim would be some priest saying it was evil. And, so do I think it's a good thing that we had all those TV shows? Probably not. But on the other hand, at least 2 years later, you'd have a skeptic there saying, actually, there isn't really very good evidence for ghosts.
I think we really need skeptics now.
Yeah.
We need to cultivate our skepticism. One
The
other thing
problem is
that we
now
haven't.
when you say skeptic, everybody thinks you mean a climate change skeptic, and that's not what it's about.
No. I mean, someone who doesn't assume that just because they saw it or heard it or read it or whatever, that it is what they think it is.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to do inquiry in your own mind. You have to question your own perception of reality sometimes. And that's kind of the kind of skepticism I would advocate.
Yeah.
We didn't have any time to talk about AI because we're almost out of time. Do you feel skeptical about AI?
Okay. It turns out that I am a deep-seated biological supremacist. And every time somebody starts talking about an artificial general intelligence, all I can think is, this is like hoping God is going to come visit, And the current set of what we call AI, which is not anything like the original conception of AI, which is these large language models and these chatbots, they are not producing answers to comments. It's math and statistics. So what is deceptive is because they use language, people look for them to make sense, and then they think they see a consciousness. But if you compare them to image generators, there's no question when you type a prompt into an image generator that it's using stuff that it has labeled somehow and that it associates with the keywords that you type in to generate an image that might have some relevance to your prompt. The text generator is no different. It's all about the prompt. It's just that people don't see that. And one of the reasons they don't see it is because the chatbot is designed to pretend to be human. There's the little dots while it's supposedly thinking. And then there's the typing one letter at a time as if it was on the other side of a modem. And it's deliberately deceptive. And that's what's so infuriating. You're mute, John. John?
Hey, John, you're mute.
Oh, I'll say it again. And now we have run out of time. And my question for you is, would you come back in a month or so and talk about AI?
I would love to do that. And
also, another thing, how about cryptocurrency? That's another one of those artificial things that have...
Well, this is it. We're at the end of the show, and everybody can look forward to hearing from Wendy again.
You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lepkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.